How do microplastics affect tropical marine systems like coral reefs, lionfish, or even just the shoreline? Sometimes you're walking along a beach and you look down and you see these blue and white and maybe green little pieces that are kind of laid out under the sand, or maybe they're just exposed from the sand along this beach. You're on a beautiful beach, you've got a beautiful sunset going, the waves are crashing in, and you see these little pieces. Those are microplastics. Those are not part of the ocean. They came in from the ocean at some point and they're just laid out on the beach. And that can affect different types of animals within marine systems. So today we're going to actually discuss how it affects marine ecosystems and what we need to do about them, and if policies and beach cleanups actually help. We are going to talk to Dr. Lisa Rodrigues, who is an associate professor of geography and the environment at Villanova University. She is here to talk about her research and her lab's research on microplastics in marine tropical environments, including coral reefs, including lionfish, including the beaches along every shoreline that she works at in Puerto Rico, in Hawaii, and so forth. We're going to talk all about microplastics and the marine environment on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up with the ocean, what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about microplastics in the marine environment. We've heard about microplastics being in the air, in the water, in our bodies. It's everywhere. And it's something that is a huge concern from a health perspective of humans and from an environmental health perspective when we talk about the planet. We use microplastics and single-use plastics more and more every day, beyond plastic straws, okay? We'll go beyond. Although we discussed it in this interview, we go beyond plastic straws. We go in just what connects and what traps coral reefs and how it's affecting coral reefs, how it affects fish like lionfish, which is invasive, so we're going to study those. And we also look at sediment cores. We talk a little bit at the end about studies to come and when microplastics actually started in the marine environment. This is a great episode. Dr. Lisa Rodrigues, a professor of geography and the environment at Villanova University, is here today to discuss her research on microplastics in the marine environment, not just on coral reefs, which is I thought at first what we were going to be talking about, focusing most of the show on, even though we talked a lot about that, but there's other parts of the marine environment that are affected by microplastics. And it's something that we need to be concerned with, and we need to, make sure that the efforts that are done with beach and coastal cleanups, as well as policies in place to ban specific single-use plastics, do they actually work? And sometimes they may work, but we don't actually see it for ourselves anecdotally when we're out in the marine environment. It's a little bit misleading, but the data shows that it actually works. So we're going to find out all about that and why that is in this interview with Dr. Lisa Rodrigues. So here is the interview. Enjoy, and I will talk to you after. Hey, Lisa, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about microplastics and their effects on coral reefs?
Hey, Andrew, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here and to chat more about that.
All right. I'm looking forward to this. This is going to be a lot of fun. I say a lot of fun because we're going to be talking about studies and research that's going on. Obviously, the topic doesn't sound like a lot of fun in terms of the effects on coral reefs, but we're going to get into all of that. Before we do, though, Lisa, why don't you just let us know who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Lisa Rodrigues. I'm a professor at Villanova University, which is just outside of Philadelphia.
Awesome. Now, studying in Philadelphia, coral reefs, not something that you find every day. I live in Burlington, Ontario, just outside of Toronto, surrounded by the Great Lakes. I'm a marine biologist. Everybody's like, what are you doing in Ontario? So I want to know, how did you end up in Philadelphia? Obviously a fantastic university. How did you end up in Philadelphia?
Yeah, so I first moved to Philadelphia to do my PhD here at the University of Pennsylvania, where I did study coral reefs. Most of that fieldwork, though, was done in Hawaii. So that's not a bad deal, right?
Not a bad deal at all.
Part of your time in Philadelphia, part of your time in Hawaii.
Yeah.
Before that, I actually was in your neck of the woods. I did a master's at the University of Toronto. And so I lived in Toronto. Yep. Yeah, I lived in Toronto for a few years. I got my undergrad from Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But I actually grew up, and I think where a lot of my interest came from is I grew up in Bermuda. And so
Oh,
on a
wow.
tiny island in the Atlantic, surrounded by corals and
Yeah.
coral reefs. And I think, that was just is what sort of generated my interest in marine biology and corals. And I think that's sort of what led me down this path to where I am today.
That's quite an adventurous childhood to grow up in somewhere like, very small island of Bermuda. It's a huge destination for people here in Canada because it's so
Yes.
close and it's such a lovely island. I had a friend who lived out there. She was an accountant over there, which a lot of accountants start their careers over there, and she would scuba dive on her as a hobby, and she learned to scuba dive
Right.
there, and then she would got into the entire like marine conservation aspect of it in terms of cleaning up litter and cleaning up trash. Obviously, not necessarily coming from the island of Bermuda, but coming from different places within the ocean. Growing up there, did you sort of grow up in a space where you saw things like this happen, where you could see like not only the beauty of living on an island, but also the consequences of living on a small island in terms of being in the ocean, seeing trash or seeing the degradation of reefs and other animals and environments as you grew up? Did you notice that as a child, or was it just like so young that you didn't have a chance to notice that?
I think some aspects I noticed. So certainly there were things that would wash up on the shore when you would go to the beach, that clearly didn't come from local areas, but
Right.
it I definitely more when I go back now, my family still lives there, and when I travel back over the years that I've lived away, that I feel like those are the times where I've really noticed it much more,
Right.
is just sort of seeing that increase over time. It was actually a few years ago. I was visiting over the winter holidays, and we had all gone out. My family and other families, we'd gone out to a restaurant that is right on the beach, and
Mm-hmm.
and after we had lunch, we were walking along the beach, and I was so surprised by basically every step that I took. There were pieces of microplastic that I could see as we were just walking. And that was actually, I mean, I'd studied corals for many years prior to
Mm-hmm.
that, but that was probably the first time where I realized, oh, this is something else that I think we really need to learn more about. Um,
It's so interesting you mentioned that because I just got back from a trip in Hawaii. Beautiful place. Obviously, you just talked about it. A lot of corals, a lot of studies that are being
yeah.
done there. And the one thing I know is we went to this wonderful beach, Lanikai Beach, gorgeous area on
Oh, I
Oahu,
know that. Yeah,
right?
that is a great place.
It's beautiful. The sand is like fine, fine, fine sand. It feels
Yeah.
so great on your feet. That's what the beach where we noticed the microplastics the most. And the funny thing is I overheard some people saying, like the people that were beside us, they thought it was something from the ocean. Like they thought it was, sometimes you have these little pieces of what looks like glass, but
Mhm.
it's not glass. It's actually from the ocean. And they thought that's what it was. They thought it was from the ocean. They didn't like the fact that I told them, actually, it's not. Marine biologists here, that's not from the ocean. I mean, it's from the ocean, but it shouldn't be. It's a microplastic. But they had no idea. Do you think there is like I mean, obviously you and I know, and especially doing a lot of work on microplastics and so forth, do you find that there's a lot of people that may not know how to identify those microplastics if they just see it on a beach? Because sometimes it's kind of hidden, sometimes it's white, and sometimes it's blue, so sometimes it can look like a shell if you don't touch it. Do you find that there's a little bit of that naivete around that?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that goes for all kinds of litter and debris, right? We don't, so, if you think about just driving your car along around the road or something, unless what I've learned in the last couple of years working with people doing cleanups is that when you start looking for it, you
Mm,
realize that it's so pervasive and is everywhere. But
yeah.
that until you reach that point where your eye is kind of trained for it, and it doesn't take long to become sort of trained with this,
Right.
is then you see it everywhere, and it's actually really difficult not to see it. Like, we actually apologize to people when they join us in cleanups for the first time, because we say, this is great and we're happy that you're here, but just so you know, you're never going to look, and you're going to see this everywhere. No matter where you look, you'll see
Yeah.
these. And so that applies to what we would call macro debris, like larger
Yeah.
pieces, as well as the microplastics. Is once you start to see it, you realize just how pervasive it really is.
And it's like you want more people to know that, but you also don't want to ruin people's sort of idea of what the ocean is and what it should be and what a beach should be or a
Right.
shoreline should be. But once you learn it, it's like, these scientists, they're always bringing us down, making us more aware of stuff, you know. But it's interesting, you know, as you grow up, you know, in a place like Bermuda. And the idea of just Bermuda just sounds wonderful, right? It must have been a fun childhood, and you again, you don't, as you mentioned, you probably didn't really notice a lot of the things that happened there. And maybe, you know, when you're a child, like when I was a child, that it maybe wasn't as persistent as it was
Mhm.
today, and as we use more and more plastics. When I grew up, Coke was still out of a glass bottle. You know, that's the
Yeah.
generation that I'm from, so may not have been persistent as it is today. What type of sort of like games did you get up to, or what kind of like life did you have as a child growing up in an island? Were you in the water a lot? Or, you know, some island communities don't like to be in the water a lot, there's a definite fear. Were you always wanting to be in the water growing up, you know, being a marine biologist?
I definitely was. I mean,
Nice.
I had, I know what you mean about sometimes people prefer not to be in the water,
Right.
and I definitely know people who fit into that category, but for me, I was always in the ocean.
Nice.
Um, so, you know, that's where I learned how to swim, was being sort of thrown out of a boat and just sort of wait to see what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, a lot of my summer jobs, through the time that I was in school, but also when I would go home from university, were related to the marine environment in some
Right.
way. It's just some aspects of science locally. um, I like, my favorite place there still, I feel like I could give them a plug, is if you're visiting Bermuda, is to go check out the Bermuda Aquarium Museum and Zoo. It's like a wonderful place. If you
Nice.
can't get into the water, that's like a really great place to see the fish and of the
Yeah.
other animals that we have there. And really just that, I spent a lot of my time there, and then also involved in research as I got older as well. And so, yeah, we really did spend our time. Like, I remember playing with sea cucumbers on the beach in my summer holidays, because we would
Nice.
collect them and then play with them on the beach afterwards before putting them back.
Right.
Yeah, so it was just, to me, it was just like the normal thing that you did, and those were the kinds of things that I learned about, and really grew to appreciate and love. And it was really, I think, getting my interest in science, and having, you know, sort of a more science background as I went into college and university, was really about wanting to understand how those different things worked, what was going on in the ecosystem. And I was just always really interested in just learning more about them.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, for me as someone who has the same likes. I mean, that is the dream, right? Is to grow up and to be around the ocean. Can you pinpoint a time in your life where you're just like, I want to learn more about these, and this is what I want to do as a career, like because growing up, you know, you're near the Bermuda Institute of Oceanography. You are
Right.
around the water. Was there any time in that childhood, or did that come later as you went to university and you did
So
biology?
I think it was really early on, actually.
Yeah.
Like I said, for me, it was, I was sort of spent more time at the aquarium, and they have a research component there as well. And so, I think, you know, probably from the time that I was in middle school, maybe even earlier than that, I knew that like, my dream job probably still would be to work there if I could. Um, but yeah, I knew that I didn't know like what it meant to be a scientist really, or to be a professor, so that wasn't on my radar.
Right.
But I knew that I wanted to do science. I knew that I wanted to do science, be involved in science in some way related to the marine environment. And so that's actually why I ended up going to Dalhousie, was that they have like a really good marine
Yeah,
program
they
there,
do.
on the East Coast. Yeah.
Yeah, and they've diversified quite a bit now. Their marine affairs program and their science and
Right.
research is just top notch in Canada. It's quite lovely. Um, that's awesome. So you have, like, growing up in Bermuda, obviously Canada's really close. So you
Yeah.
learn about Canada, and then you end up in the U.S.
Right.
afterwards. And when you come out of Dalhousie, was it still coral reefs on your mind? Was that still what you wanted to study, or was that when the microplastics started to come into play?
No, so yeah, my sort of research sort of trajectory was after I finished, I had a degree in biology from Dalhousie. Um, I knew that I wanted to do a master's. I really enjoyed, I'd had some experience doing research at Dal, and I knew that I wanted to kind of keep doing that. So I looked around, I ended up doing a project actually partially based in Bermuda and partially based in Toronto.
Okay.
On I worked in a lab that focused on crustacean behavior, and I studied uh, an organism that's on reefs. It's a hermit crab that's actually endemic to Bermuda.
Okay.
That's actually really cool. It's a really cool hermit crab
Hermit crabs
species
are awesome.
what one of the things that I found out about it is that the males are primarily mobile in the way that we would imagine hermit crabs to be. They walk around in shells. But it's unique in that the majority of females of the species actually live in tubes that are fixed to the reef, and so they cannot move around.
Wow,
And
I did not know that.
yeah, and so it's a really interesting species. Again, this is one I haven't studied this in years and years. I'd
Yeah.
love to look at it again, but there's a lot of kind of just interesting behavior that we studied related to that, like whether there was some choice in what the females were doing. Turns out that there's not. They're kind of relegated to living in
Interesting.
these like suboptimal little tubes.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's so I studied that at the University of Toronto. I actually took a year off after that and worked in Bermuda at the aquarium doing research more on terrestrial work there. And then I ended up finding an opportunity at the University of Pennsylvania to do a PhD, and that's really where I got into like coral reef
Right.
ecosystems.
Right.
And it wasn't until in the last sort of like 5 or 6 years that I've been at Villanova as a faculty member that um, it just sort of became clear that studying plastics, marine debris in general, as well as microplastics, was something that I would like to do more of. I'd been working with a colleague of mine in my department who focuses on river ecosystems, and we were
Okay.
studying in Puerto Rico the impacts of pollutants coming down the river, mostly focused on sort of dissolved pollutants like
Hmm.
sediments and things like that. But we realized that that system in Southwest Puerto Rico was really ideal to also study debris and microplastics. And so we were able to get funding to continue that work. And that's kind of
That's
how I sort of
wonderful.
transitioned into that area.
Okay. And now, we've seen, microplastics really come to the forefront of sort of one of the major issues, I would say,
Mhm.
in the ocean in general, even in our world. I think it's really exploded over the last, I would say, 5 or 6 years, especially over the last 2 years, where we're starting to see studies come out and being published of, microplastics being in our body, being in the
Yeah.
air, being in the water. And as marine biologists growing up in the last 2 decades, we've seen microplastic. We knew there was a microplastic problem before there was a microplastic, or even just a plastic debris problem. We knew that was a problem. We could see it, continuing. Not much had been done with it over the last 2 decades. Now we're really starting to see more policies put in place, studies being done. We're really starting to see some of the major consequences of these actions and the non-actions of what hasn't taken place. Um, studying coral reefs and marine debris, why coral reefs at this point? Like, it's such a broad subject, and obviously you want to niche into a certain place. Totally understandable. Why coral reefs?
So there are so many other stressors that are on coral reefs, some of which I've studied.
Right.
And so this, there are many studies that have shown when you have these sort of multiple stressors, just like with humans,
Yeah.
if you're sick, you're more likely to have something else happen to you, or it's harder to do things. Um, and that's the same thing with corals, is while they're much simpler organisms, they're definitely this sort of compounding aspect of multiple stressors is something that is really important, because we're sort of
Hmm.
throwing many, many things at them. Um, and so this sort of felt like kind of a natural next step for the research that I was doing, whereas previously mostly focused on some of the physiological impacts, like sort of what's happening in the coral's body when
Yeah.
different stressors happen. Um, and so to sort of now tie in this other aspect, we haven't directly, there are other studies out there. We haven't directly in my lab looked at what the direct impacts are of microplastics on corals, in part because it's very difficult to study in the field, which I
Yeah.
think is where the important questions are.
Right.
And so instead, what we've been doing is looking at some of the more broader ecosystem impacts of beaches, mangroves, and tropical river systems that are sort of all adjacent to coral reef
Mm.
ecosystems. And we sort of look at the impacts there. And what we're trying to understand is kind of where the debris is coming from, where it lands. So like, where does it sit for a while? Because then that can kind of tell us where we're more likely to find microplastics, and maybe also give us some clues as to where we can kind of do some prevention
Right.
and more management activities.
Right. This is perfect. We just got into a lot there, and I want to kind of break it down a little bit
Sure.
because there was so much there that it was kind of juicy from a scientific point of view that I wanted to break down. We talked about cumulative effects in coral reefs. Now, obviously, we have bleaching because of major heat, sun, like even more sunlight exposure. We have ocean acidification are some of the three major things that have caused mass coral bleachings in the past, and even just the development of, with ocean acidification, the problem in developing stony corals or any kind of coral that uses calcium and so forth. And I don't want to go into the details of that because we've covered it on other podcasts, and we want to focus on the microplastics here. But when you start to look at, you mentioned in the field it's very difficult to study just the direct impact of microplastics on these corals because we have all these other things that are affecting it at the same time. Is it possible, I know for some people, some researchers, where they actually take corals and grow them in situ, or sorry, not in situ, but in a lab,
Mhm.
where they can manipulate the environment a little better to tease out those cumulative effects. So, in essence, like control light, control heat, and then expose them to microplastics. Has that been done so far before, or have you done that, or
Yes.
anybody else done that?
Yes. So there are several studies where people have done laboratory experiments like you were describing to assess the impacts, and or they have sort of varied questions. Sometimes
Right.
it's just a simple question of, do will corals consume
Right.
these microplastics or not? And there's kind of a mixed bag of results, I think, in terms of what's out there. So depending on the species, depending on the sort of the details of the study, you can find that corals, yes, will eat microplastics and consume them. They tend to be more likely to do so if the microplastics have a biofilm on them. So, like if you
Oh,
leave
interesting.
something with water in water, no matter what, even if the water looks crystal clear and clean, there's bacteria in there that will end up causing like a sort of a slimy film on the
Yeah.
surface of things.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's a biofilm, is there's a sort of like microbial activity that coats the surface of something. And that, we think, the sort of the thought behind that is that ends up being like a mimicry to something that would be food.
Hmm.
um, and so the corals might just be fooled, and other organisms too might be fooled into thinking that this sort of seems like it is something edible, and
Right.
so they ingest it. In the case of corals, the other thing that's kind of interesting is they have also been known to spit out microplastics, so they
Huh.
ingest. Um, And so it's hard to know how much actually stays in. So corals polyps are just a really simple sac.
Yes.
They have just one opening, unlike humans and other animals where we have two openings.
Right.
They just have one. And so, you know, food and waste goes in and out of the same opening. Um, and so they also don't really have, they have a stomach, but it's not really the same kind of thing that we
Hmm.
have. And so they don't, it's unclear how much digestion is going on, or whether they're the same issues that we see with birds or fish when it comes to ingestion of plastics. Um, so anyhow, there is this sort of like complicated story, I think, of they definitely do consume. They seem to consume more when they're covered with biofilm, but they are able to also egest. And so because of that, it also has become more challenging to try to understand what the potential long-term impacts might be, um, on corals themselves, in the way that, you know, other researchers who focus on fish or birds might more easily be able to sort of determine.
Right.
Um, so anyhow,
That's the
that's out for my understanding of what we kind of know so far.
Yeah, and it's such a broad kind of subject matter. I think a lot of people think corals, they don't think of how many different species of corals there are around the world, right? There's a lot of different ones. They all react differently to heat, to temperature, to ocean acidification, and I'm sure they all, will be different when it comes to microplastics and their exposure to microplastics, just like nutrients and so
Mhm.
forth. So it becomes a difficult thing to study. From the study where you did in the river system, uh, where you looked at sort of how debris would affect the entire ecosystem, was that the approach you took at when you first started looking at corals? Is just how does it affect a coral reef instead of an individual coral, or did you go to the individual first?
So for corals, we typically, the way that I've been studying it is we focus on individual species
Oh, cool.
first,
Okay.
and not as much on the overall system, although we try to draw conclusions that can
Yeah.
apply to the overall system.
Right.
And so in part, I think some of that is because the corals that I've been studying mostly are in Hawaii. And there are fewer species that are there, especially in a particular bay that we work in, where it's much of the bay is dominated by two very distinct species. And so a
Gotcha.
lot of the work that I've done has been focused on sort of a comparative
Hmm.
study. Sometimes they tend to do different things. They have different
Right.
strategies. But yeah, we tend to, at least for me, I tend to focus on the coral, and I think that's in part just because I would consider myself to be more of a physiologist, like sort of trying to
Mm,
understand how the underlying, um,
yeah.
biology is working in the system.
Right. That makes sense. That makes complete sense. Now, at this point of the podcast, people are listening and they hear, okay, so you're at Villanova University, fantastic university, right? One of the best in the country. You do field work in Hawaii. So the first thing people are going to ask me is like, how do I work with Dr. Rodrigues so that I can live in Philadelphia and then I can go to Hawaii once, maybe twice a year? Do you get a lot of students who are also interested? Because coral reef is, when you first get into marine biology, especially students, they want to learn about, the top subjects are marine mammals, sharks, and then you have coral reefs. Do you get a lot of people who come and be like, hey, look, I've seen your work. I like what you do. I like where you go. How do I work with you?
I do. So we
I
do
can
have a lot of
imagine.
students who are likewise interested. I try to emphasize that it's not as glamorous as it sounds.
Yeah.
To try to kind of ensure that the people who do work in the field are ones who are able to deal with the less glamorous
Right.
aspects of, your elbow deep in seawater on a regular basis in tanks, and corals smell funny, and it's long hours. We study coral reproduction, and that happens at times during happy hour typically. So we gotta watch corals reproduce
Yeah.
instead of going to happy hour. So things like that. It's not as glamorous. There's it's while it's amazing and it's beautiful, it's a really wonderful experience, and I
Yeah.
feel very privileged to have had them. It's also, you're working in the hot
It's
sun.
hard work.
It's a lot of hard work. It
Yeah.
can be very physical. This just swimming alone, and
Yeah.
having to do work while you're swimming is a lot. But yeah, we definitely don't suffer from lack of volunteers for
Of
working in
course.
Hawaii or Puerto Rico, which is
Another
another nice
area.
to
Yeah,
spend
not
time.
too bad the places,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Now, but like talking about working in these places, like in the ocean, if you're, a lot of times you can find corals in shallow areas, but also, I just went to Hawaii, like as mentioned, I just got back and I saw that there were, hazards in the ocean in terms of currents and riptides, and being along the shore in those areas can be quite dangerous in a way.
Mhm.
The big saying there is don't turn your back ever on the ocean because you never know what it's going to do. The bay that you I believe you said there's one bay that you worked in.
Yeah, so we work in
Where is it, and how is that in terms of safety is in that area?
Sure. So we work primarily off of the coast of Oahu, which is
Okay.
the main island of Hawaii, where Honolulu is located.
Yeah.
But on the sort of the opposite side of the mountains from Honolulu, there's a marine institute there called the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology.
Right.
And when I was a graduate student doing my PhD, and then also since then as a faculty member at Villanova, we've been working there on and off. It's located in Kaneohe Bay,
Oh,
which
okay,
is one of
cool.
the largest bays there. It's
Yeah.
not too far from Lani Kai that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
Um, it's a very sheltered bay. The the Marine Institute is itself on a small island,
Okay.
and that island is completely surrounded by fringing reefs. So
Oh, wow.
you barely need to get your toes wet in order to be able to see corals, and even then you could stay fairly dry and see them from land. So everything is fairly close. It's one of the reasons why there's just so much research that is actually done at
Hmm.
that location. It's relatively easy to work with. And then throughout that bay there are also patch reefs that are kind of distributed throughout the inner part of the bay. Um, and then as you get further out into like just sort of at the mouth of the bay, things can sometimes be a little bit more choppy.
Hmm.
Um, but that usually those are more experienced people will go and
Right.
do that work out there. So
Yeah.
so yeah, it's a nice place.
Yeah.
They have really great facilities in terms of on the island itself to be able to do experiments. And so we've done before tank experiments where we can bring corals into tanks in seawater and do some manipulations and things like that. So there's a
That's
lot
great.
of different
That's
things
nice to have.
yeah, it's great.
Yeah, that's amazing. You mentioned earlier, looking at where corals are situated was important. Near the mouths of rivers, but not all corals are near the mouths of rivers. We know rivers can be a spot where debris comes out and
Mhm.
microplastics are created through that. Um, have you found a difference in terms of corals that are closer to rivers being exposed to marine debris compared to coral reefs that are further away from those rivers? Is there a significant difference in those types of exposures?
That's a really great question. It kind of depends. So we've seen more sediment impacts than direct debris impacts in those, but there'd be some parallels, is my guess. So the corals that are closest to the mouths of rivers tend to be heavily impacted by sediments, but I've also seen in some locations, so in Puerto Rico where we work, some of the healthiest corals that I've seen in that region are right at the mouth
Huh.
of where they're so well adapted to living there. This was a place where I had to hold hands with my dive buddy in order to be able to not lose them because I
Hmm.
couldn't see them. I could even barely see their bubbles
Wow.
from scuba diving.
That's kind
That's
of
how,
insane.
yeah, it was like just pea soup plus there. And yet the corals that we just like, and you don't, because it's so difficult, the visibility is so bad, you kind of, it's sort of like this otherworldly kind of experience where you kind of swim up until they're right in front of your face. You realize, oh, wait, this is a coral.
Right.
um, were so healthy and what I would describe as a happy coral. Its polyps were all extended. It was happily feeding. So there can be definitely some local adaptations that are probably
Hmm.
happening. Um, and it's funny, we don't see as much debris in those kinds of areas. I'm sure it's there at at the micro level. It's just very difficult to measure and quantify. Um, but yeah, we tend to see most things will be on a reef in terms of debris where you have kind of protrusions on the reef, things that, you know, that debris can get wrapped around
Yeah.
or trapped on. Um, but I think that a lot of the sort of when the reef is a little bit more smooth, then the debris tends not to get caught, at least the bigger pieces.
Hmm.
And so we typically don't see it all that much. It kind of varies.
So when you say smooth, are you talking about like flat type of corals that are like
Exactly.
almost like plate corals, like
Yeah, so
monocoral?
more of like or even sort of rounded mounding corals
Right.
where there's less kind of crevices or less upright where you have more branching corals and
Yeah.
um or other branching structures or where it does seem like you more debris is piling up and
Interesting. Yeah.
stays there.
Very interesting. That's really, yeah. I think that's cool. That's cool to see those types of differences. Again, looking at the different species and diversity, the shapes of the corals, in terms of how it kind of intersects with all these different pathways that they can get
Right.
exposed. Right.
Right, and we see parallels in other ecosystems as well. So, in mangroves, which are usually adjacent to these coral reef ecosystems and are trees that are going to grow in saltwater, their roots tend to be the places that get plastic bags or rope or things like that twined around them, and you see that becomes
Hmm.
like sort of an obvious feature sometimes. um, but that in other areas that are maybe more flushed where the water is able to, yes, bring things in but then also pull stuff out, it may not, water bottles or things like that might not stick around uh, all that long in the
Right.
system.
Because it wouldn't necessarily stick or connect to it.
Exactly, it's
Yeah.
not getting trapped in the same
Right.
way. So there's the variety of the way the ecosystem looks, but then there's also the variety of the trash that we produce and
Right.
how that plays into it.
Yeah. And even though seeing a water bottle is not good in the ocean, it may not affect the corals in that situation.
Exactly, it may not have the same kind of abrasive or shading impact that
Right.
rope or plastic bags can have.
Is there, with all these different adaptations, the different shapes and different features of a coral, and even where where they grow and where they're located, is there a common method that you can evaluate the health of the coral in terms of being exposed to microplastics, because a lot of times when we hear about like microplastics in marine mammals, we see it in their tissue and the chemicals, there's an increase in the chemicals from those microplastics in their tissue, so
Mhm.
they obviously absorb it into their system. It doesn't sound like this is happening with corals, or am I wrong here? We've just not gotten to that part.
I think I don't know that we know yet
Okay.
if how much chemically there's an impact or not. So yeah, I'm not sure that we're there yet. With corals, um, one of the features that has typically, well, there's two things that we typically study. One is sort of their photosynthetic potential. So like
Yeah.
how, right, like if we remember that corals are symbiotic between an algae, an endosymbiotic symbiotic algae and an animal, How good the photosynthesis is one parameter that we tend to look at when we're looking at health of the overall
Hmm.
coral. And then another parameter that we tend to look at are sort of the energy reserves, like sort of how much fats or carbohydrates or proteins are being built up in the animal portion of
Gotcha.
that. And so possibly the plastics could impact both of those
Hmm.
areas, depending on how significant it is. Like, ingestion of microplastics could cause, sort of hypothesized to maybe cause self shading or shading to
Ah,
happen, and maybe the
interesting.
algae can't photosynthesize. And then if you can't photosynthesize, then you're not taking in energy. So there could be these kind of cascading effects. um, some of the species, so one of the species that I've studied in the past in Hawaii is a really big feeder. So one of the ways that it is able to survive coral bleaching is that it tends to feed on plankton more. um, and so that could also be another impact. If your little gut is full of plastics, you won't be able to maybe feed as much
Right.
or digest what you do feed on plankton. And so there could be these other things, but at least as far as I know, I haven't seen studies yet that have taken it to that level, that sort of physiological level with microplastics in corals.
That's really cool. Like to see, it feels like we're just scratching the surface, no pun intended, in terms of what what it could do, and really bringing a light into, again, no pun intended, in terms of how this, like the physical aspect of trash being on a reef, like a plastic bag being caught on a reef. Or it was amazing, when I was walking in the marina where our hotel was, and there were the corners of the marina where you just see the devastation of a lot of the trash that accumulates within a marina, whether that's from the boaters themselves or just a way that this is where the currents led them to, and,
Mhm.
and this is where it is. But it wasn't just like plastic grocery bags. There were some like industrial bags, and there was like a lot of debris that you would not expect, oil caps and things like that. It was quite devastating to see that in, what I expected, like Hawaii to be pristine and so forth. I think it's just, you falling for that dream of these Hawaiian waters being so amazing, but they fall victim to a lot of pollution, whether it's from the island itself or from outside of the island. When you do studies like this, you're obviously doing it to see the effect, to see how we can manage it better, right? And the overall aspect of how can we lower the effect of marine, I guess, of marine debris on coral reefs themselves, especially from this physical aspect. Um, what have you? I know it's early on in the process, but what have you come up with? Like, what have you seen, or even talk to colleagues, or even come up with yourselves, where we're just saying, like, how can we get rid of this problem? Like, how can we stop it? Coral reefs tend to be really close to shore. They're the first, sort of one of the first types of ecosystems that really feels the impact of this debris. What can we do as a society, and just like to force policies to stop this from entering the water or even affecting the corals?
So I think there's several different layers of this that we can work on. And I think sometimes at the individual level, I think it's important to remember, no matter where you live, no matter how far you are away from the ocean or how landlocked you might be, every single drain that you see leads to the ocean. And whether that's an indirect route where the drain is going to your local lake or river, that is eventually is getting to the ocean. And so every piece of litter, that is in the city of Philadelphia, which is where I
Right.
live, will eventually end up in the ocean. And
Right.
so I think that's important for people to be aware of and remember, because I think especially if you're a person who loves the ocean, um, and it's your place of choice on vacation and things like that, I think you can have a really big impact on the ocean by how you treat your city as well,
Hmm.
or your town or your neighborhood.
Yeah.
And kind of thinking about those sort of local things that you can do. I think sometimes there's such a disconnect when
So
we're
true.
that we don't sort of realize, but that really every single drain that you see is connected to the ocean. Honestly, including the ones in your house often as well. So
Yeah.
there's like
So true.
really there's like no end to our connection to it. And so I think that's one thing that's really important where we need to sort of do better at litter and waste management on all sorts of levels, even if we're not a coastal community. Although, coastal communities, I think especially, and usually those are the places where people are very conscious of those kinds of
Hmm.
things.
Hmm.
Um, we also find that de- that this debris travels really long distances. So some of the things that we found on beaches in Puerto Rico, we are pretty sure have come from the coast of Africa because of
Wow.
some of the writing on them. We
Right.
think we find some things from the coast of Brazil, most likely, again, because of like the writing and the language. In some cases, like the item that we're pretty sure has come from a Brazilian grocery store, was printed in 2015 and we're finding it in 2021. So,
Wow.
so not only are they traveling long distances, but these things are in the environment for a really long time. And so anything that we can do to remove the item in the first place,
Hmm.
properly dispose of it, maybe also rethink what we purchase too. And this is tough because, as a society, especially if your listeners are maybe mostly in North America, you are gonna have we don't have a lot of choice. It's really hard to find, like, so I sometimes will spend a lot of time in the grocery store where I try to find the same product but in glass instead of in plastic or something like
Yeah.
that. Or,
Or
you know,
can of some sort. Yeah.
exactly. Or we,
Yeah.
switch to something that is more in paper, or, instead of shampoo in a bottle, what about shampoo in a bar form, which is now a thing.
Yeah.
Um, so I think thinking about the small things that we as individuals can really
Hmm.
do to pick up the waste when we can, but also not to be producing it in the first place, I think can be really beneficial. And then there's also, like, then I would say sort of the next scale up in terms of community action. We see really big improvements with regular cleanups. So one of
Hmm.
the things that we do in Puerto Rico, we did them twice a year at first, and then the wonderful people that are there are super excited by this, and so they've been doing them more regularly on a bi-monthly basis at two different beaches. 80% of the debris that we find at these beaches is plastic.
Wow.
80%. And
Wow.
so, but we also see that if you do these regular cleanups, you can significantly reduce the total amount that you find. I mean, it's crazy to think about, but you could go every 2 months to the same spot and
Yeah.
still trash, even though you cleaned it up, spotless 2 months ago. And so having that kind of regular investment in people time and effort, I think, is also really important, because doing that builds really big awareness, right? Like,
Hmm.
you start to really appreciate, and start to really think about, wow, if I don't want to spend my Saturday morning doing this, what are some other things that I can do to prevent this from happening in the first place? We also work with a lot of local restaurants
Hmm.
in the area near the beaches in Puerto Rico to try to encourage them to reduce the packaging that they
Hmm.
use to distribute food. And so that can also be something,
Yep.
in terms of the businesses that you support. Um, maybe your favorite restaurant or shack or whatever that is by the beach, you could always encourage them to think about um, paper instead of plastic, or or dishware instead of plastic. And those can all have kind of long-standing, I think, benefits on that kind of scale.
Yeah. These are all phenomenal things because I really like just working locally, and it seems like a lot of it's community driven, not only individually, but community, like the cleanups comes from a community aspect, but it comes from And I've seen this from organizations like Rare. It comes from a place of pride. Like if
Right.
you clean up, if you spend the time as a community to clean up these beaches or these waterways, whether you're in Philadelphia, you're in Burlington, you're in Hawaii, you're in Puerto Rico, you see the difference over time, and you start to say, hey, we actually can make a difference locally. We may not be able to make it from a world perspective, but we can make it locally. We can keep our bay or whatever clean in this particular area, and then we take pride and we can talk to people about that and put in, and going over what works, what doesn't, successes and challenges to help other communities do the same thing. I love that aspect. I even love the aspect, again, talking about local community, going to your favorite eatery and just being like, hey, like, I see that you have a lot of plastic containers. Can you just put it in a bag, or can we do something else? It'll really help. We clean up the beach like twice a month, and I see this stuff all the time. Can we move? I really like that connection. And I feel like we've moved away from that, especially in North America. We've moved away from that local connection and having that relationship with people you respect, not from a place of, hey, don't do this, you're an awful person, but hey, I've seen this happen. And a lot of times, your branding was on it. You don't want to see that. Like, let's
Hmm.
try and figure out ways to do it. Whether it works or not is something to be said, like something to look ahead at. But I feel like that really helps in terms of this type of moment. But it seems like people are really just continue to be disconnected from the ocean. Even being in Hawaii, I saw a lot of things that surprised me. And it comes back to this. The first thing I see, you're at a lot of restaurants when you go away. Every time a drink came, there was a straw.
Hmm.
Compostable, biodegradable or compostable straws, which I know aren't really compostable. They're basically plastic. And you just sit there and you're like, look, I understand people are sick of the plastic straw thing. I get it. And I understand maybe we went too far as a conservation sort of plethora of like conservation community to really focus in on that. To me, it was like a gateway to other plastics and our usage of plastics. But it seems like people are almost rebelling against that. You've seen the current administration. We've seen people, just regular people, just being like, I'm just sick of it. I don't want to have a paper straw. Um, how do we, as the scientific community, as conservation people interested in conservation, not even scientists, how do we combat that? Like, what's your opinion on that when we start to see people rebel against the conservation things that we want people to take?
Yeah, I sort of see it as a sort of a fatigue in a way,
Yeah.
right? We're just so sick of, and I get that. I totally understand that sometimes you hear so much about something that just doesn't kind of connect. Like, why are we caring about this tiny little tube?
Right.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think one aspect that I think is important to keep in mind that maybe will help with this is all of these larger pieces of plastic that we use just one time, whether we dispose of them correctly or we don't, all of those things will end up as microplastics over
Right.
time as they degrade. And so all of the kind of health impacts and the things that are these like scary headlines that you mentioned at the start about where we're finding microplastics in the human body, we can potentially reduce the total number of microplastics if we just get the big things out and we stop
Yeah.
utilizing them. I think it's also important to remember with plastic that there are these big pros and cons. So imagine you have to go to your doctor's office. You are going to be pretty darn sure and that you want your doctor to be using all kinds of plastic, right? Plastic gloves, plastic, everything, whatever. Because you can see the package being open, you know that it's sterile, you know that so there are definitely places, hospitals are one where we want to be using
Yes.
single use plastics and where they're really important for people's health. And but then there are places where we don't need them. Like if for the majority of people who are healthy and have good motor function, they should be able to drink out of a glass without a straw. You don't need
Mm-hmm.
to use even a paper straw, really.
Right. Yeah.
And so, it's to think about, I feel like, I think as a society, we need to decide what are the types of plastics that we all admit, yes, actually, these are really important. And in these situations, this is when we want to use them. But that, I don't need a plastic bag to carry my loaf of bread home from the store with me,
Right.
like I don't need a plastic straw in order to
Right.
drink from my glass when I go out, because I don't
Mm-hmm.
use one my guess is most people don't use them when they're at home, right? Like
Yeah.
and so I feel like that's the thing that we maybe need to get at is to for scientists and policymakers and conservationists to be more upfront about the fact that it's not just about the straw, it's about all of these things that we really don't need to use, so that we can be in the position to decide which ones we do want to use, and
Mm-hmm.
what's the value of those items.
Yeah. It's like prioritizing the value of
Exactly.
plastics, right? And how they
Exactly,
should be used. Yeah.
because I do think that we have gone a little bit overboard with things,
Yeah.
in some cases maybe, and that
Yeah.
all people have heard is don't use straws, but they haven't actually been informed about why that is the case and what is sort
Mm-hmm.
of behind it. Um, yeah, and there's also a whole nother aspect of this which we haven't really talked about, but it's the fossil fuel aspect. And so all plastics that we use, regardless of whether they're biodegradable or not, are derived from fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And so the more that we use plastics, the more that we are dwindling down our very limited supply of oil and natural gas. um and those are having all those other impacts that we talked about that are affecting the ocean: coral bleaching, ocean acidification, warming, all those other things. And so there's this underlying aspect about plastics that we tend not to talk about as much. There's the debris part, which is huge and which we see, but there's also the source of where these things are coming from. And again, if we are better at deciding what we use and what we don't use, we could also just be better at even conserving fossil fuels as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Fossil fuels, what was it? I think it's 30% of fossil fuel revenues, or revenues to the fossil fuel industry, is coming from plastics. That's what they
Exactly.
make.
I mean,
It's insane.
a big portion of the natural gas that's being
Yeah.
produced in my state of Pennsylvania gets shipped all around the world in order to produce plastics.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily being used to heat homes or to drive
Right.
cars. It's going into plastics, and then we just we use it once and we throw it away. And
Yeah.
so again, I think those are sort of societal questions. What do we as a society think is important, and what do we want to have done? And then I think that helps to drive policy. But when policy doesn't necessarily follow science, I think that's where the consumer has a lot of power, and can really, really make a difference by their actions and what they purchase or don't purchase. And I think that does. I mean, we see that often. That can go a long way into making important changes happen.
Yeah. No, 100%. It's an interesting, like, complex issue that we're in with this type of things. And again, I think it's the disconnection from the environment that a lot of people have these days, in terms of, let's not interrupt our daily lives to make these changes to help the ocean, when we don't see a lot of things that are happening in the ocean for many of us who live inland. But we're all connected. And I think when it comes to, I think you were right from the get-go, Lisa, when you mentioned, like, it's about community. Do things local. There used to be that saying that really, I think it hit home, was, was it act local, think globally. And it's it still reigns true today. We we don't say that as much, but it still, reigns true today. And although those things need to be done at a policy level, at a federal and state and provincial level and local level, we still need to act, and we still need to understand that the way we work, the way we do things as a society will affect things down the road. And sometimes we don't have a lot of say in terms of what happens, but there are times when we can take care of our own local places and make a difference. Now, there's a couple more questions I have and this is a great conversation. I love this conversation. I can probably have this conversation for hours and hours on end, but I want to be mindful of your time. There's a couple questions. The first one is, as you're out in the field and doing things with your students and your colleagues, what's the most frustrating aspect of working with, looking at the effects of like microplastics and debris on coral reefs? Like, what when you're out there, like when you see stuff, as you mentioned before, sometimes it can be hard to sort of realize how much, marine debris and microplastics are out there. What's the most frustrating thing for you as not only a scientist, but as a person, as someone who wants to protect the ocean and the lab that you have? What's the most frustrating you see as a collective, as a lab?
That's a good question. I guess I don't know. It's funny. I don't know that there's a lot that does frustrate. Like I feel like there's just so many kind of exciting things that we
Yeah.
find that we don't have time to get frustrated. But
Okay.
I guess probably thinking about it more is really just the the pervasiveness of it can get you down and frustrated.
Right.
Where because we are seeing these things so regularly, there is, so like I said, we've found things that have traveled very long distances, and at first there's this like, oh my god, this is so cool, this came
Yeah.
from whatever
Like
place many
Tokyo
hundreds
or
of miles
whatever,
away.
right? Yeah.
um and but then it sort of, when it dawns on you, oh wow, this thing has been in the ocean for many years, or many miles, kilometers. I think that can sometimes get kind of frustrating. Like I was saying before, we could go back to the same exact spot every 2 months, and it doesn't look like we were necessarily
Hmm.
there 2 months before. The
Right.
data show that the number is going down. So when we
Right.
actually quantify it, we do see
That's
that the
interesting.
numbers reduce. But that, just looking at it, it's very hard sometimes to discern that there has been some improvement.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think sometimes that can get a little bit frustrating for people, for just anybody really.
And is that the reduction? Is that the actions of people cleaning up, or is that the actions of policies actually working, do you
I
think?
think that's the action of people cleaning up.
Okay.
As far as I know, at least in that area, there
Yeah.
hasn't been any real change in policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's that we are just cleaning up more regularly, and so we see it. Locally in Philadelphia, a colleague of mine has been working on more upstream areas of some local rivers. And there we've got he has some evidence that shows that plastic bag bans that are happening in some municipalities but not others may be having an impact on what they're finding in the rivers. So there
Okay.
is some evidence
Yeah.
that policy is having an impact.
Yeah, which is nice. Like both, the cleanups and the policies. It's nice to see that both have the evidence showing that they work. I think that's really important for communities to understand, for people to understand, because I think people are like, what's the like, what can we do?
Right.
There's microplastics all over the ocean, in the Mariana Trench. Like, there's nothing we can do about it. And sometimes we rely too much on government and expecting those policies to go through, but we don't actually go out and do the work ourselves, or even work within our local, councils, and say, hey,
Right.
shouldn't we, if this works, shouldn't we have a cleanup crew? Like, wouldn't it be
Right.
great to have that cleanup crew, like here in Burlington, hire some students, clean up
Yeah.
the debris on a regular basis, and measure it, see if
Yeah.
it reduces, see if it works. I think,
Absolutely.
yeah, I think that's really important to tell people, is that it actually works when it's done, even though it may not seem like it is. That
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Is that, and it partly I think it's just our memories that it's
For
hard
sure.
to kind of remember what it was like the last time.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you take the time to collect the data, and it doesn't take a lot of extra effort to do so. There are a lot of different organizations online that have tally sheets for these
Right.
kinds of cleanups. And so you can find something that
Yeah.
suits you, and then it's actually kind of fun when you're out there. When you pick something up, before you put it in the bag, you just like make a little tally of whatever it is,
Yep.
because that could also help you identify where things are coming from. But then it can also help, the totals at least can help you see whether any new policies are having an impact. And that's what we are starting to see. So, really, at sort of township or municipality levels, or city levels, depending on sort of how your area is organized, can sometimes pass specific legislation around just their area.
Hmm.
um, and those like plastic bag bans or what have you, those can have really strong benefits to them
Yeah.
over time. At least it seems like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it will. And I think we just need to reiterate that and communicate that fact to the people that it does actually work, because I think a lot of people are just so disconnected from that aspect. Last question I have for you, and this I find is an interesting one as well, is what studies that you have upcoming or that you are working on right now, that may not have been published on yet? What are you excited about studying, looking at, or maybe even some preliminary results that you're just like, oh, this is going to be interesting?
Yeah, so we have a couple different microplastic related studies that will hopefully be coming out in the next few months or a year maybe. But we have we've looked at microplastics in lionfish, which are an
Mm.
invasive
Hmm.
species in the Caribbean, native to the Pacific. And we had the opportunity for there's some groups of people that cull them, remove them from the
Yeah.
environment in the Atlantic. um, and we found microplastics in 98% of the
Wow.
species of the individual fish that were out there. Anywhere, I think we had a total of, it was sort of in the 50s, I think was the total number, so it's a decent amount. um, and they averaged about 6 microplastics per fish.
Wow.
um,
They're not like terribly big fish either. Like
they're
they're
not
not, right?
huge.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're not huge. And size didn't seem to play a role in
Mm.
this at all, which was also kind of interesting, which we were not expecting.
No.
Um, so, that could be one of the things that is difficult to do with microplastics is sometimes, especially for organisms, you have to harm them in order to figure out what you have. Um, and that's not ideal when
No.
all our species are already under threat for a variety of different reasons. So,
Right.
an invasive species maybe becomes an ideal target. We want to remove it anyway.
Hmm.
Um, and so then we can also study these other aspects of it. So that's one of the things that we've been doing with a former grad student of mine. And then, we're also kind of looking at this idea of when do we first start seeing them in the environment? And so
Mm.
we've been taking cores where we sort of dig down
Oh yeah.
into the sediment
Yeah.
to look at different layers over time. And so far we have not been able to get down deep enough where we don't see any. So we
That's
we
scary.
we
That's
do
scary,
see
Lisa.
it's a lot. It could be, yeah, I mean, it could be because these are mostly beach environments, and so
Right.
they turn over quite a bit anyway,
True.
so that might be the case. We're going to start looking at these in other sort of more
Mm.
stable environments too. um but I think that's kind of exciting, and I think
Yeah.
that um can really make people sort of take notice of just how how far it's not just sort of on the surface and spatial, but that there also is a lot of time behind this as
Yeah.
well. And that I think, that can that really the time for us to stop some of these bad behaviors is now.
Yeah.
or we just kind of continue to push this into the future. And I think that kind of a study can really help show that and help depict the sort of the timeliness of these kinds of problems.
Yeah. So is it safe to say in your studies, your focus now, a lot of it is on, like, the question is where is microplastics impacting the marine environment? Because it's not just coral reefs, it sounds like. It's looking at, okay, let's look at where it starts and how far down does it go. Let's look at, is it affecting, invasive fish, and using that as an opportunity to study, as we're taking them out. Is that safe to say that your question is like, how do microplastics affect even the coastal environment or a tropical environment?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's, to me, because of just how connected all of these things are,
Hmm.
um, in space, but also how they behave with each other, I
Yeah.
think it becomes, in some ways, I feel like I've sort of moved a little bit past corals in some ways, because
Yeah.
I know that there are so many different other avenues that we can look at, and we can still tie it back to the
Yep.
coral reef ecosystem. So yeah, I think that is accurate. That we definitely have been moving into some of these other areas. A lot of it is driven by students, actually, though. So
Right.
sometimes it's students who come with their ideas, and their interests, and so that helps to kind of broaden some of the things that we're also doing.
Yeah, I love that aspect. I love what you're doing. I love what you and your labs are doing, and even empowering the students to kind of come up with their own creativity, and like, where is it impacting them, or where do they think the impact is on them. I think that brings a lot of interest and creativity into your program, and I think it comes up with a lot of results that we've seen. And I'd love, Lisa, for you to come back on the podcast to talk about more of these studies, so that we can see these results, and people can hear them for themselves, and here's some optimism from that. Policies work, beach cleanups work. It may not look like it, but it does, and I think that's wonderful. So I want to thank you so much for coming on the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It's been great to have you on. I can't wait to have you on again.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. It was is really nice to chat with you about all of this.
Thank you, Lisa, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I can't wait to have you back to talk more about some of the research that's coming up and some of the stuff that you're going to be publishing on and getting results on. It sounds really incredible. It sounds like it's needed. It sounds like we need to know how the environment is affected, so that we can put management and policies in place so that we can get rid of this stuff, right? That's how important it is. That's why it's important to have scientists like Lisa and people in her lab to go out and do this type of work. It's not easy work, even though, working in Puerto Rico, working in Hawaii sounds like a wonderful trip. And I'm sure there are aspects of the trip and when they go in the field that are phenomenal, but it's also very difficult to see environmental degradation like they see each and every day. And to have that optimism that the stuff is working, beach and coastal cleanups, as well as policies in certain places that are working, we need to talk more about that. We need to get that more on podcasts like this, on videos like you're watching on YouTube, on social media like you're probably going to see me put out, is the fact that there are places where it works, and it's unique to everybody, but we need to find out more of where these policies and these cleanups are actually working. And that's why it's important, when you do a cleanup or you do a policy, you measure and evaluate the results. That's the important part. And you adapt to the management and what is working for other people and what doesn't work for certain places around the world. So it's really important to connect everything together, but it's also important to act locally and think globally. That's what we're going to be talking more about in upcoming podcasts. Getting that optimism back, getting the fact is that we are connected to the ocean always, no matter where you live, whether you live in Burlington, Ontario, or live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or you live in Hawaii or Puerto Rico, where you see the ocean every day. We're all connected to the ocean in some kind of way. And we need to make sure that our communities, our own regions, are protected, and we take care of them as a community. We can't just let other people do it. We can't let the marine conservationists and the conservationists and the scientists leave it up to them to do it. We have to do this. We have to take care of our local area. And that's including myself too. Need to be more connected to where we are. But that's what we're going to be talking about in future episodes. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. Lisa was such a great communicator. Want to have her back on soon. And I told her after, I said, you should be on more podcasts. You should be doing more of this, because people need to know what you're up to, because I think it's really important. But so I want to thank Lisa. I want to thank her lab for the work that they do. And I wanted to thank you for listening to this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. If you want to know more about how to protect the ocean, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can subscribe to our Spotify channel, watch the video on Spotify, or listen to it on your Spotify app. You can also listen to it on Apple Podcasts, on Amazon. But if you want to find out if your favorite podcast app is available, go to our website, speakupforblue.com. That's speakupforblue.com/podcast to be able to listen to all of our episodes and find your favorite podcast app so that you can connect to it on the go, on the run, and listen to it each and every time. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday is when we release episodes. So if you want to go there, speakupforblue.com. If you have any questions or any concerns, you can email me from that website, or you can hit me up on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.